Well, good morning, church. I hope that everyone had a great week. I probably don't have to spoil this for you, but I am not going to be a fan of any sort of snow blizzard sort of nonsense in mid-March. So I know it happens, but I'll be glad whenever, that passed. It's hopefully everyone had a good week. A lot of wild week for me. Lot of things going on. Tell you all about that later, but. Exciting times around the church, so always be praying for the church. Lots of things happening. And just a funny anecdote. Last week I talked about how, things get said all the time about, well, pastor said this or that, and, it's news to me sometimes as I hear about what I've said. And I was talking to Joe at some point this week, and he reminded me of one that cracked me up. I think within my first month or so here, maybe it was a couple months, I don't know. It was at some lunch thing. Someone came up to me, he's like, yeah, look, I know you don't like Italian food, but this, and that. And some of you may still believe that about me. I have no idea where that came from. I don't know. I told the person at the time, I said, nope, I love Italian food. I've never not. Even Joe this week, when he told me, I was like, yeah, I ate lasagna the night before. So anyway, it's just a funny anecdote of how, I don't know I do know these things happen in churches all the time. It's just gossip, idle talk. But anyway, we don't have to get down. I have the sermon for that for y'all later. No. But in the way of announcements, we have, as you mentioned, but anyone listening online, we've got Jimmy's funeral. But I do want to add on to that, if you go on to his obituary at the Proco funeral website, there is a link for those of you who aren't going to make it for the snow, so you can actually watch the live stream that way. We have nothing to do with that, so I don't know how it works, but look on his obituary. There is a link there. As you heard, business meeting after church, family discipleship position, 3 weeks to Easter, so it's been in your announcements, but that's our regular Sunday. But Good Friday, 6 p.m. on Friday. I encourage everyone who can to go to that. I'll talk more about that in the coming weeks, but that is always, I said it last year, that is always probably the service I look forward to the most. I think that it is an important and a powerful service, so I encourage people to go to Good Friday. I think it's important to take some time out of the week to just remember and honor what Jesus did for us on the cross. And then we also have the Q&A series. Anyone watching online, I didn't hear the announcements. I don't think it was mentioned, but regardless, you have the brown box on the table. Also, there is a phone number in your bulletin. You can text a question, but if you have a question, I'm only going to open this up for a few weeks because I have to get on it if I'm going to do this. And so if you have anything that you're interested in, it could be theological, doctrinal, practical, anything Bible, church related, any of those topics. We had some good ones last year. Feel free to put that in there, and if people don't, then that's okay. We'll move on, but I want to just make sure you know that's open. Do it anonymously. I always would rather anonymously, unless you just want to tell me, that's fine too. But doing anonymously sometimes allows people to feel more comfortable asking questions they would rather not either say or know was attached to them, which hey, Andrew, I'm a little hot on the mic. Can you drop me just a bit? Thank you. It just sometimes allows me to answer some questions that maybe other people are thinking or struggling with. And so, go ahead, submit those or don't. That's up to you. But either way, we will continue having sermons. It'll just be whether we're going to do Q&A or we'll go right into the beginning of Genesis. That's up to y'all to decide. But with that being said, I think that's it in the way of announcements. So let's go ahead and jump into our message this morning, where we're continuing our series on the Gospel of John titled, Who is Jesus? Because with his work, John will present his answer to that question, and his hope is that we will believe in him. And last week, we ended with Pilate questioning Jesus, and Jesus replying that he came to testify to the truth. And then we read this response by Pilate. Look at John 18, verse 38. What is truth? Said Pilate. Now, we don't know, but it seems like a bit of a cynical response by him. But this is where we left off. So we will start with verse 38, finishing up the verse, and then we'll continue on with the rest of our verses. Again, Pilate at this point is done questioning Jesus after the religious leaders have handed Jesus over to him, wanting him to be killed, to be crucified. So let's go on, verses 38 through 40. "What is truth?" said Pilate. After he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no grounds for charging him. You have a custom that I release one prisoner to you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a revolutionary. So after Pilate's examination of Jesus against the charge brought against him by the religious leaders, Pilate goes out to where the religious leaders were, and he gives the verdict. Jesus is innocent. Pilate found no basis for the charge against Jesus. Now, in case you forgot what the charge was, because this is certainly going to be relevant in our verses, we see where the charge came to the forefront in Pilate's first questioning of Jesus. We read this in verse 33 of chapter 18. "Then Pilate went back into the headquarters, summoned Jesus, and said to him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?'" So the charge against Jesus from the religious leaders is that Jesus is claiming to be king of and over the Jewish people, which would have been a big deal. That was a treasonous charge in Rome, a charge certainly deserving of death if it was true. Now, of course, Jesus was never seditious against Rome. They knew that. The religious leaders, everyone knew that, really, and even Pilate comes to that conclusion, as you see again in verse 38. But at the heart of the matter, in many ways, is that the religious leaders simply did not believe that Jesus was the promised Messiah, or did not want to come to that conclusion, whatever it was. So, you remember, if you've been with us through John, they were questioning John the Baptist about who he was. And there was this whole process with Jesus, and they just did not believe that it was him. So they wanted to get rid of him, because the people were very much into Jesus. You know, the whole healing thing and providing thing, it's pretty popular. And they were worried that people would follow Jesus as the Messiah. So they decided that they were going to charge him with treason by saying that he claimed to be king over the Jews, at least in the sense of, political kingdom that would rival Rome. So with that in mind, Pilate comes out, again, tells them the verdict. Jesus is no threat to Rome. His claim to kingship was not political or treasonous. So verdict is, Jesus is innocent. Now, we see something interesting starting in verse 39. Pilate, as we just read, declared that Jesus was innocent of the charges against him, so you don't have to be a legal expert to figure out if someone is innocent, then they should be released from custody. Anyone who's innocent would be, but we don't see Pilate do that. We don't see him say that he's going to release Jesus now that he realizes, or come to the verdict, that he's innocent. Instead, we see him bring up this customary practice where he had the ability to release a prisoner at Passover. So Pilate questions them to see whether they want to release Jesus under that custom. So what is happening here? Again, go back. Pilate has this verdict. Jesus is innocent. So why in the world is he asking if he should release Jesus? I mean, just release the guy. You have the authority. What are we doing here? Why is this even a question? And the answer, though it's not clear, it still seems kind of clear, but it's not made directly. It's found in how Pilate more than likely was trying to appease the religious leaders. The fact is, Pilate was extremely unpopular with the Jewish people, having a bit of a hostile relationship, certainly with the religious leaders, and part of it was just the fact that many within Jewish society just did not like being occupied and ruled over by a foreign adversary, that being Rome. If you know your history, eventually, well, even before that, you had the Maccabean Revolution, that revolt. Later on in AD 70, you'll have another one where Rome comes in and destroys the temple. So really what you see is that Pilate, overall, he's facing a tough situation here. One that he did not want to get out of control. He sees that the religious leaders want this man dead. They're pretty adamant about that. And he knows that they could They could make things difficult on him. At the very least, they could start a riot or use other avenues that would potentially, maybe even at the end of that road, lead to his removal. Remember, he was already unpopular. So it appears that Pilate is here, and we'll get scripture confirmation of this later, that Pilate was anxious to not set off the Jewish people. So I believe that's what we see at play here when Pilate offers to release Jesus under this custom, instead of just releasing him because he is innocent. For him to release Jesus under his custom means that in essence he would bring a conviction against Jesus, give the religious leaders their conviction, because you can't release a prisoner who's innocent. That's not that's just releasing someone who's innocent. So Pilate could give the religious leaders their guilty conviction of Jesus, give them what they want. He's guilty. But then Pilate could do the right thing and release Jesus knowing that he's innocent and not put him to death. So you see what is at play here. This, I believe, is probably what Pilate sees as a win-win situation. Hey, religious leaders, you gave me this guy. You want a guilty verdict? Here it is. I'll give you the guilty verdict. But again, Pilate knows he's innocent. This man doesn't deserve to die. So we'll have this guilty verdict, but then I'll release him under this custom. So Jesus will walk free. You got your scalp, if you will, your pound of flesh. You got your guilty verdict. Everyone is happy there, except I guess Jesus, who just got a guilty verdict. But at least he's alive in that sense. So it appears that Pilate's trying to play both sides. He's negotiating with the religious leaders in order to try to make everyone happy. So how's that going to work out for Pilate? Well, verse 40 comes around, and it's not that great, because the religious leaders shout back that they want Barabbas released and not Jesus. And then John tells us a little bit more about this man, saying that he was a revolutionary or a robber, as you may have in your translation. But revolutionary is actually a pretty good way to describe Barabbas, because from the other Gospels, we know Barabbas did rebel against Rome. You'll see this later. And he even committed murder. So Barabbas is a bad guy. Barabbas got the guilty verdict that he deserved. And at the height of irony here, of course, there's no mistakes in any of these things that happen. Really, they're accusing Jesus of what Barabbas was actually guilty of there, and yet they're chanting for Barabbas to be released and Jesus, who was innocent, to die. Barabbas deserved death as a revolutionary against Rome. Jesus, who was innocent, they want to free Barabbas as a revolutionary, and yet Jesus is innocent, and they want to kill him, which would be the proper end for someone who did something like Barabbas did. So again, a little bit of an interesting detail there. Let's continue on to verses 1 through 5. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers also twisted a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and clothed him in a purple robe. And they kept coming up to him and saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and were slapping his face. Pilate went outside again and said to them, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know I find no grounds for charging him." Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." So, what's Pilate going to do now that his whole, master bargain here, his master plan, did not go the way he thought? Well, he decides he's going to have Jesus flogged. Even though Jesus is innocent, again, we got to keep coming back to that, his own verdict there, it appears as though Pilate is still holding out hope that he can satisfy the religious leaders and still not kill Jesus, as they were looking for him to do. So it appears Pilate has Jesus flogged to still in hopes that they would eventually accept this grand bargain. Now, this flogging here, taking a second, it appears this flogging that Jesus received at this point was a less severe version of the ones you would read in the rest of the gospel. And I say that for two reasons. First, the other gospels have Jesus being flogged before he's crucified, while here in John, Jesus is being flogged before Barabbas is even released. And finally, when you look at a Roman scourging before the cross, the beating that they would do, it was brutal. where a person was beaten to where their bones and internal organs were often showing before they went off to the cross. It was so bad that sometimes the person receiving it did not make it to the cross because they died from the beating and the shock and all that came with it, the exposure of organs and things of that nature. And of course, it was meant to be that way because that hastened death on the cross. It also added to the overall torture, being on a wooden cross, amongst other things. So with this in mind, this does not appear to be that type of beating or flogging that Jesus received here. Of course, he was badly beaten. Let's be clear about that. But this is not what you would read, it appears, in the other Gospels before he goes off to the cross. But Jesus, again, he's badly beaten. Then we read how there is a crown of thorns put on his head. And we should keep in mind the thorns aren't, your little tiny thorns here. These were probably about 12 inches long that were just being driven into his head. And the Roman soldiers put a purple robe on Jesus since, the charge against him is he's a king. So they put on a purple robe that speaks to royalty. And then to complement their continued insult of Jesus, the soldiers were hitting him and mockingly saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." So after the beating, the mockery, Pilate emerges repeating his verdict. He says it again. Jesus is innocent. There's no grounds for charging him. It's unjust that Jesus just went through this that Pilate put him through. And of course, we see Jesus coming out wearing the robe, demonstrating the mockery. Pilate parades him in front of the religious leaders and the people to show what he's done to Jesus. Let's continue, verses 6 through 7. When the chief priests and the temple servants saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate responded, "Take him and crucify him yourselves, since I find no grounds for charging him." "We have a law," the Jews replied to him, "and according to the law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." It seems as though, as I talked about, Pilate thought, okay, they didn't want me to release him under the custom, right? So I'll beat him up, I'll rough him up a lot, and then surely at this point, they'll have gotten their pound of flesh. Certainly at this point, they'll get the guilty charge. Jesus is in bad shape right now, 12-inch thorns driven into his head, just a rough situation. He's gotten mocked, beaten, all that. Surely they'll agree to this whole grand bargain. But we see that isn't the case. Despite Jesus being paraded out, they still chant for him to be crucified. And then Pilate responds, telling them to go crucify Jesus themselves. Now, of course, Pilate knew they couldn't do that. So this is Pilate just upset, pointing back to the fact that he had hoped this whole grand bargain would work out. Yet despite all he's done to Jesus, they're dug into their position. They want him dead. Well, the religious leaders, they respond to Pilate's angry retort with a statement about their law, how they believe Jesus should die because he has made a blasphemous statement that he was the Son of God, which was a statement of divinity. Now, let's continue on, verses 8 through 11. When Pilate heard this statement, he was more afraid than ever. He went back into the headquarters and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus did not give him an answer. So Pilate said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know that I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" You would have no authority over me at all," Jesus answered him, "if it hadn't been given you from above. This is why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." So after the religious leaders point out how Jesus has claimed divinity by being the Son of God, we read that Pilate was afraid now more than ever, which may seem a bit odd, but to someone in that day with a Greco-Roman background, the idea that someone could be a divine man was not unreasonable at all. There were certainly beliefs among some Romans, that a god could appear in human form. You could have the whole God-man thing in a demigod situation or other things like that. So Pilate hears this new information, and he's not a big fan of that because what has he just done to Jesus, who he's also made clear that was innocent? He's kind of roughed him up a lot. Jesus is in a bad state already, and now he's hearing, there's a claim to divinity with this man, and so that's not good news, because if Jesus is a God in his mind, that means that he might face some sort of divine retribution, and again, a bad situation. So this leads Pilate back to where he was before, and he continues his questioning of Jesus. In light of this new information, Pilate asks Jesus, where is he from? Pilate seems to be trying to discern, is this man really divine? So, seems like a good question to ask. Where did you come from? Jesus doesn't give Pilate an answer, though, which does not make Pilate extremely happy. So Pilate reminds Jesus of his place. Jesus' life is in Pilate's hands. He can release Jesus, or he can be the one who has him killed. So answering Pilate's probably a good idea if someone was in Jesus' place, according to Pilate. And then Jesus responds to Pilate with some truth for him. The power that Pilate has over Jesus in this moment is only because it was given to him by God. God has worked out everything for this exact moment for Pilate to have this authority to be able to eventually sentence Jesus. Pilate is not the one in control. It is God. Yet Pilate is sinning. This is why Jesus says, this is why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin. We won't dive too deeper into that, into levels of sin or all this, but it's clear Pilate's sinning, but yet every single thing that is happening is because God determined it. So any authority that Pilate has is because it's all happening according to God's will. Now, we're going to take a little break. This is a little rest stop on our journey. We're going to call this a little theological break here. For those of you who have a more theological bend or interested in some systematics or all that, I do want to touch on something very quickly, because we hear things like this, that Pilate is sinning, in which he is. This is an innocent man that he's abusing and soon going to convict and sentence to death. But then we also see statements like this by Jesus that talks about, look, the only authority you have is because God has given it to you. Like, this is all happening according to God's plan, which means including Pilate's sin is happening according to God's plan. So people get caught up on this, and reasonably so. And then the answer, the kind of hang up here is more in the realm of, well, this is all happening according to God's plan, but Pilate's sinning. Is Pilate even guilty of his sin? What are we supposed to do with that? Because you could certainly look throughout the entire story of Jesus. What about Judas? Judas sinned in a horrible way, yet Judas had to do what he did so that Jesus would end up in his place to eventually go to the cross. You could go down this rabbit hole in many different ways. Well, what's happening here theologically is called divine concurrence, if this is your thing and you want to learn a bit more. The theologian Louis Berkhoff defines this divine concurrence as the cooperation of the divine power with all subordinate powers, according to the pre-established laws of their operation, causing them to act precisely as they do. Isn't that a fun definition? I'm sure it's clear as day now what that means. But basically, what this is getting at is that divine concurrence, the Bible presents it this way. Human beings have absolute responsibility over their actions and their choice. We are not robots. We have a real choice, and we are responsible for those choices. And yet, God's power is so great, his sovereign power, completely ultimate, that even in our choices, he's in complete control. Even when there are evil choices, he is in control of that to use it for his good. Every single action is both an act of God and an act of the creature. Nothing that happens apart from God's will. Nothing. Not a single thing. Because if it does, then God's not in control, and then this whole thing falls apart very, very quickly, because how could we be certain that the end is going to be the end? And who is sovereign in that situation? Is it God, or is it the person or the creature or whatever it is that is outside of the sovereign's control? So nothing happens apart from God's will, but all actions of the creature ultimately are the realization of God's will by their own self-action, and ultimately then they bear the responsibility of it. A little bit deeper down the hole, since again all clear as mud here, I do want to throw this up here. This is from the 16 89, London Baptist Confession of Faith, good old Baptist confession here. It's in modern English to help us out here. It says this about this whole idea. The almighty power, unsearchable wisdom, and infinite goodness of God are so thoroughly demonstrated in his providence that his sovereign plan includes even the first fall and every other sinful action, both of angels and humans. That is an important thing. The first fall was within God's plan, and he knew what was going to happen. Everything is under his plan and under his power. God's providence over sinful action does not occur by simple permission. Instead, God most wisely and powerfully limits and in other ways arranges and governs sinful actions. Through a complex arrangement of methods, he governs sinful actions to accomplish his perfectly holy purposes. There's a heretical view that states that God, it's as if God's just waiting there to see what the person chooses, and he's like so good that he can react despite what the person chose, even though it be a sinful one. That is heretical. That is not what we believe. We believe that, again, God is so powerful, as the first line says, his wisdom so unsearchable, his goodness so infinite, that even in every single choice and every bit of evil, he is in control. And he works it all out. Not just the end, but even before the sinful choice is made. Last part. Yet he does this in such a way that the sinfulness of their acts arises only from the creatures and not from God. Because God is altogether holy and righteous, he can neither originate nor approve of sin. God is in control of sin. He is not responsible for them. We are moral creatures. Every creature has a choice and will face the consequences of their choice. Now, to land this plane in our little rest stop here, I'll come up with a better thing than rest stop in the future. Pit stop, I don't know. But if you think that I'm stretching this or this isn't there, all you have to do, the clearest example of this in the Bible is the story of Joseph. Just go back to Joseph's story. And Joseph, by the way, makes this clear. Not only in Genesis 50, where he tells his brother, what you meant for evil, God meant for the good, and the saving of many souls. You could back up to chapter 45, verse somewhere in the middle there, 5, I believe. But he ultimately tells his brothers that they should not be grieved or angry that they sold Joseph, because they find out who Joseph was. And they're like, whoopsie daisy. Not only is that bad for us, but what a horrible thing that we did. But he says, don't be sad. Don't be angry. He told them why. That God sent Joseph ahead of them to save lives. I want you to think about that for a second. Through the evil action of the brothers, got him sold into slavery. That caravan took him, sold him into Egypt. That got him into Potiphar's house. That then had another sinful action with Potiphar's wife wanting to sleep with Joseph and him doing what was right, getting falsely accused, getting thrown in prison, interpreting the dreams of the chef and the cupbearer there, and then ultimately, at that point, having another sinful action where it was the cupbearer who said that he would tell. He didn't tell. 2 years pass by, and then Pharaoh has a dream, which is then Joseph's moment to interpret the dream to rise to power. There was a lot of sin happening there, and man, I love the Bible. And then when you go through that, and I'm way off base now. When you get to Joseph's story, it's so interesting. Throughout the book of Genesis, you have God so active and the writer making it clear what God's up to so often. But then you get to Joseph's story, and oddly enough, God basically goes quiet. You don't get any more than likely, Moses under the inspiration of the Spirit telling us what God is doing behind the scenes. Despite the rest of the book, it's very clear, and it's such a beautiful story. We don't get insight into what God is up to, and yet Joseph had perfect understanding that God worked it all. Every sinful action, every evil done, Joseph says, don't worry about it. This is all God. Now I'm here. Now I'm exactly where I need to be, and God is going to save many lives. So if you ever doubt this idea of divine concurrence, that sinful actions, people are absolutely responsible for it, and yet God, we think way too little of God as if he's not fully in control of all things. We do. We just think, and that's the silliness of when we get to heaven. You know, people are like, I'll stand before God, and I'll know, okay, get out of here. You will melt in an instant. It will be nothing. Even for him to have saved you, that's when you're going to come to a greater realization of how much we've taken for granted the cross and what Jesus did. The minute you get just a taste of the power of God. Anyway, I've spiraled. Now you got a whole extra sermon. Let's get back on the highway here. Let's get back to verses 12 through 16. We read, "From that moment, Pilate kept trying to release him, but the Jews shouted, 'If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar.' When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside. He sat down on the judge's seat in a place, in a place called the Stone Pavement, but in Aramaic called Gabbatha. It was the preparation day for the Passover, and it was about noon. Then he told the Jews, 'Here is your king.' They shouted, 'Take him away, crucify him.' Pilate said to them, 'Should I crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar,' the chief priests answered. Then he handed him over to be crucified. Then they took Jesus away." So, though we aren't told why, Jesus' response to Pilate has convinced him all the more that Jesus needs to be released. And it's so frustrating reading these verses. You go, okay, you're convinced Jesus needs to be released. Well, I don't want to tell you how to do your job, but just release him. You have the authority. Just release the guy. But we see why Pilate doesn't want to release Jesus, because after apparently telling the religious leaders that he will or wants to release Jesus, they shout back at him that anyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So if Pilate does release Jesus, he's no friend of Caesar. And that has some deep meaning probably in that day. But what we need to know is that the religious leaders are basically signaling they'll make life hard on Pilate. And Pilate would probably, maybe, potentially get removed if he releases Jesus. After religious leaders make it clear they aren't budging and will make things, as I said, difficult on Pilate if he releases Jesus, Pilate sits on the judgment seat with Jesus near him. He tells the crowd, "Here is your king." The crowd was specifically with the religious leaders, respond to Pilate that Jesus should be crucified. Pilate wants to know, "Why would I crucify your king?" And the religious leaders declare they have no king but Caesar. And at this point, Pilate realized there's nothing more he could do to try to appease the crowd. His great bargain is over. As a matter of fact, it's gone the opposite way in many respects. So now he hands Jesus over to be crucified. So what should we take away from these verses? Well, in these critical moments that the verses cover, I think we get such an important window, such an important look into the depravity that truly is within our hearts, the evil that pops up within us as humans. Now, some of this is going to sound a bit repetitive, and that's okay, because this is what the verses point out. But this is angling somewhere, right? So let's start again, as we have for many weeks, with the religious leaders, right? Talked about it plenty of times. They are in this mindset that Jesus must die. They know he doesn't deserve death. They know the charges are false. They don't care. In their minds, it is worth it for them and for the nation, right? The end justifies the means, something so many like to think, how they think through things, whatever it is. But what is so surprising, and why I keep bringing it up, is that these people, they should have known better. They knew the law. They're scrupulous about all these things. They were even looking forward to their promised king and Messiah. Keep that in mind. They wanted the Messiah to come. That's why they questioned John the Baptist at the beginning, and they went on even trying to discern with Jesus if he was the Messiah. So they should have not fallen into this trap, but yet what we see here is astounding. What we see here, church, truly is the crescendo, if you will, of what has happened with the religious leaders. It has gotten worse over time from the very beginning to now. Again, it is the crescendo. We see truly how far their sin has taken them. And let me show you what I mean by that. Go back to verse 15. They shouted, take him away, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Should I crucify your king? We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. I want you to sit with that for a second, right? They know they're trying to kill an innocent man. They know all this sort of stuff that's happening. And they've justified it in their minds. But now, incredibly, they are not only trying to kill an innocent man, but in essence, they're denying the kingship of God over them. These are the leaders of the Jewish people who at this point or saying, we have no king but Caesar. And that is an astounding statement right there. Because these people understood, I mean, certainly the religious leaders understood that Israel, God's people, was only supposed to have one true king over them. It was God. For instance, Exodus 15:8, the Lord will reign forever and ever, talking about the people. And then you have that famous scene, if you know your Bible, in 1 Samuel 8:7, where ultimately the people ask Samuel for a king, and then Samuel brings it to God, and then we read, but the Lord told Samuel, listen to the people and everything they say to you. They have not rejected you. They have rejected me as their king. So I'm just pointing this out, that these people, listen, especially the religious leaders, they knew that God was supposed to be a king. They knew even God promised a Messiah for them. Someone who would come and establish God's kingdom. You know, like bring back the Jewish rule, right? They were looking forward to that. And many of them, certainly I'd probably say most, there's no clear understanding of it, but I would say most of them hated the fact that Rome ruled over them. They were an occupied nation. This is why you had these different revolts at times. This is why it's going to come to a head in AD 70 when the temple is destroyed brick by brick, right? But what's so powerful about this, church, and this is why we've walked through it, highlighting the religious leaders and their sin, is that now, at this point, their sin has taken them to a place that I doubt they could have ever imagined they would go. I doubt you could have gone to them at the beginning of Jesus' ministry and said, hey guys, by the end of this, you'll be standing before Pilate declaring your loyalty to Caesar as king over y'all. They've probably been offended. They might have killed you right there for some sort of blasphemous statement. Yet here they are proudly declaring that we have no king but Caesar. This is incredible in a negative way. This is such an example of what I've talked about before, but we could not see it any more clearly here. Sin will take you further than you can ever imagine, than you could ever think. You may think it's just a little thing. You may think the ends justify the means. You may think that this is the best route for you, even if it means bending a little, doing this way, like, oh, you know, this and that. Before you know it, you will find yourself in a place where you don't want to be. And where, through your actions, you're in essence declaring that you have no king but Caesar in your own way. Whether it's loyalty to a nation, to a person, to whatever it is, we end up denying the kingship of God over our lives if we are Christians. So this is why I talked about the human heart and the depravity found within it. It is truly depraved. You cannot trust it. You have only one source of truth and knowledge, and that is God's word. And that is what he has left for us. Otherwise, the more you play with sin, be careful, right? We reap what we sow. And then, I'm reading through Ezekiel right now, just a fascinating book. One of the reasons why, as Ezekiel gets a vision of the temple and God's judgment and different things, the people, with all their idolatry, all their bad things, they said in their hearts, well, God doesn't see it. Like, where's God? In essence, where's God? As if God doesn't see your secret sin. As if you could outlie God in these sort of ways. You better be careful. And if you want a stark picture of it, the religious leaders over the people are here declaring, no king but Caesar. I mean, I keep coming back to it because it's unbelievable as I was studying and sitting on it, and just cuts to my heart about how far sin brings us. We dabble in it. We make excuses for it. It won't be that big a deal or that bad. And by the way, you may think you've escaped, but we just never know. You never know what could happen as a result, and you can't go back. Once you find yourself at this place, it's too late. How many people regret and say, oh, I wish I wouldn't have done that. I wish I wouldn't have ended up there. Well, of course. Yeah, don't do it. That's the way. That's the whole point of the book of Proverbs, amongst other things. You must kill sin. We'll get to this in detail later, but it's such an important verse for all of us. Genesis 4:7, God talking to Cain before he murders his brother Abel. If you do what is right, won't you be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you. You must rule over it. Part of the battle we have in this life, church, is you have to rule over sin. You have to discipline your body, your mind, your emotions, every single part of you. You leave a crack open, it'll get through somehow. It's like one of the most frustrating things about like ants or something like that. I don't even know where those little suckers come from, but like they somehow, there's a little something there. You think you did everything, and now you got, it's like 6 billion ants or something. Or like a breeze, whatever it is. If there's a crack, it will get through. But so where's like the practical takeaway here? What can I do to help you out with it? Well, these verses show us sometimes we learn what we can do by what we shouldn't do. And we actually see a good example of what we shouldn't do when we look at Pilate. Because what did we see him do? He was negotiating with what he knew was wrong. He was negotiating, in essence, with sin. Pilate judged Jesus was innocent, and he had the authority to release him. He had a duty to release this man, as any good judge, anyone in authority would do. But what did we see Pilate do? Well, he wanted an outcome that worked well for him. He saw an opportunity, right? I could give the religious leaders a little something here, get a little favor, we could work out, maybe, what is it, enemy of my enemies, my friend? Yeah, some whole situation going on them, but what ended up happening? It ended up not working out for him, right? They were set on killing Jesus. He did not realize how far gone they were in that this man would die. So what was he going to do? Was he going to stand up for what is right? Nope. He just kept trying to negotiate, kept trying to find ways around it that would still kind of work out well for him, but it didn't work out. And he knew it. He did know what he was doing was wrong, but it didn't work out. And before he knew it, he was up against a crowd that was ready to riot. Let me give you that in Matthew 27, verse 4. Matthew tells us this. When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that a riot was starting instead, he took some water, washed his hands in front of the crowd, and said, I'm innocent of this man's blood. See, this is what's so important, right? When we think we can negotiate with sin and evil and what we know is wrong, you're not going to win that. You're just going to be taken down. It's just going to, again, take you further than you want to go. You ever tried to play with a kid that was filthy and you're clean? Good luck. You don't think you're going to get dirty? You think your cleanliness is going to wash off on the kid? Another old saying, if someone's up at a higher elevation, someone's lower, which one's easier, to pull someone up or to pull someone down? We have to think through these things. We try to negotiate with what's wrong, with what's not right, and before you know it, you're Pilate, who, if he'd have just released Jesus, probably wouldn't have been good. But now, with this whole back and forth nonsense, a riot is breaking out. And so he found himself where? At a place he didn't want to be. Instead of doing the right thing, he tried to play it, tried to do all this, and it was bad. And then it's better for him that a riot didn't start. Look at verse 23, Luke 23, verses 23 through 25. But they kept up the pressure, demanding with loud voices that Jesus be crucified, and their voices won out. So Pilate decided to grant their demand and released the one they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for rebellion and murder, but he handed Jesus over to their will. Look, we don't know. I'm going to guess that Pilate didn't wake up that morning and go, hey, man, I think I'm going to sentence an innocent man to death, and then end up releasing this horrible rebel against Rome who murdered someone. I think that's how my day was going to go. Of course not, right? But he tried to negotiate with what he knew was wrong. He tried to find this kind of happy thing where everyone was okay, and then this is where he's at. Now he has to do it because, right, he's not going to pay the price to do what's right now at that point, so he gives in. And that's how it goes for us so often. We negotiate, we try to come around, but then a lot of times eventually we end up giving in to the sin. Or at the very least, we compromise in some significant ways. You start over here, you negotiate, you just get pulled towards it. So this is something we do. And so when we're talking about how sin can bring us further than we want, you want something to take away? Don't ever think you can negotiate it. Don't ever think you can just be smarter than sin. You don't think you can outsmart your depraved heart there without the will of God? in your mind and the power of the Holy Spirit moving within you. So these are important warnings, church. They should, and these verses, as I hope they do, they should always convict us. I hope verses convict us. I hope they humble us. But they bring us low to know what? We have a great God. The lower we go, the greater God looks, that he would want someone like us, that he would do what Jesus is soon to do in our verses for us. And so what's so incredible about these verses, church, what should truly let us leave here just full of hope and just full of joy that we have such a good God, is despite the depravity all through these verses, despite the absolute crescendo of sin that the religious leaders have done here. And hopefully as we examine our past, our own choices, our hearts, and we see how much lightly we take sin and how often we negotiate with it, and again, get brought low with conviction, what do we also see in these verses? We see Jesus. We see Jesus not only being obedient, as we talked about before, but absolutely incredibly, as I highlighted. Jesus was accused of being a traitor and a rebel, yet he was innocent. But Barabbas was absolutely guilty of the very thing that Jesus was being accused of, and worse. And what do we see happen here? Though he was innocent, Jesus ended up taking what Barabbas deserved. And while Barabbas got what Jesus earned, which was his innocence, which was, would be his innocence would lead to his freedom. What a beautiful picture of what is going to happen on the cross and what is a story for all of us. We are, in essence, all Barabbas. We are guilty. We deserve it. This is what these verses point us to. This is what that crescendo is there for. Your sin is terrible. It is horrible. It is, I don't care how good you think you are. Sin is an affront to God, is a rebellion against the God of the universe. And we've all seen sin take us to places we don't want to go. And all these things, we deserve to face death, but we don't because of Jesus. And that's what's playing out right here. Barabbas represents us. Jesus ends up taking his place on the cross. And then Barabbas gets what Jesus deserved, which was freedom. Jesus takes our sin, the punishment for it on the cross, and we get freedom. Freedom from sin, freedom from the judgment that we have. This is what's so beautiful about these verses. This is what they remind us of. Jesus stood there obedient while all this nonsense was happening, knowing that he was going to the cross for someone who absolutely deserved to be there. And that's, again, this is what's so beautiful. Let the verses humble us, but see how incredible this is. See what it points us to, a God who loves us that much if we are his. Amen? Bow your heads and pray with me. Father, as always, we're so thankful for the day that you have given us, Lord. We're thankful that we could be here in this church, in a place where we could just come together and worship you through the word, whether through singing, through fellowship, whatever it is, Lord. And we thank you that we can preach the word here. As always, we lift up our brothers and sisters in Christ around the world, especially those who are in persecution or fear for their lives or have to go underground to just have your word, or for those who would just crave to have your word and they don't have access to it, Lord. I just pray that you would touch them, that you would work in their situations, protect them, Lord, and we certainly can't wait to see them in eternity. But God, we thank you for what these scriptures point us to, the conviction about our hearts and how dark they are and how they will take us to places, God, so far and deep in rebellion against you. But we also thank you for what these verses point us to, that yet if we are yours, you still saw all that and loved us still and made a way for our sin to be taken care of, to be brought into your family, to have everlasting life. So we thank you for that, Lord. We do want to pray for all the needs in this place, many needs, Lord, lots of things going on. Please work. We just pray as a church that you would work in these situations that are coming to our minds, whether they be about us, whether it be about our loved ones, families, friends, the nation, whatever it may be, God. We just pray that you would work in these situations, working powerfully, miraculously even, Lord, all so that you could get the glory. But over all this, we pray your will would be done because of also what we covered this morning. Your absolute goodness, your infinite goodness, your unmistakable, unquestionable power. God, we know that you've got it. And that includes that you have us. So hold on to those who are walking through darkness. Give peace to those who have fear. God, bring provision to those who are in need, reconciliation, God. Whatever it is, we're just asking that you would do it, and that you would encourage them even through the darkest time that you have it. So God, you're a good God. We can't thank you enough. You are good and you do good, and that's never more clear than in Jesus. And we thank you how these verses highlighted such an incredible truth of how he took our place and we got what he deserved. We thank you for that. And it's in Jesus' holy and precious name we pray.